Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Sam Jackson, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program, APIs, Fueling the Federal Data Strategy, hosted by Software AG. During today's webcast, we'll explore API management and integration, from creating and publishing to the web to usage, access, governance, feedback collection, and security, to leverage data as a strategic asset to achieve mission goals. But before we get started with today's program, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. To the right of your screen, you'll find several icons, including the Q&A tab, which allows you to ask a question. We'll be fielding those questions toward the end of the program, but feel free to submit along the way so we can get right to them at the end. If you experience any technical difficulties, there's a red button at the bottom of the screen that says Test Your Connection. That button will take you to a help page, and from there, you can browse a number of technical solutions, or you can chat directly with a member of our support team. This webcast is being recorded and will be available on demand shortly after, and closed captioning will be available for that on-demand program. Now, let's meet today's speakers. Joining me today is Andrew Fichter, Product Owner for the Lighthouse API Platform at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and Terry Milholland, former CTO and CIO at the Internal Revenue Service, and Jeff Estes, Director of Technology Solutions at Software AG Government Solutions. And now, we'd love to go ahead and get started with kicking off our presentations. So to get us started, we'll open the floor to Andrew. Andrew?
Hello, everyone. So my name is Andrew Fichter, and as mentioned, I'm with the Department of Veterans Affairs, and I'm a product owner on the Lighthouse API platform. And it's my honor to be doing this work, to be kind of getting to work on really exciting technology that has a real impact on veterans. So before I go into talking about the program, I'll just give some background on VA and the mission of VA at a higher level, and then the IT department at VA. So Lighthouse is the name of our platform, and it's a veteran-centered API program. So who is VA? Well, I mean, everyone's heard of VA, but does everyone know what VA does at a lower level? So we're committed to delivering the best care and services to all veterans, and we are an immensely complex organization. We're actually the second largest U.S. federal agency, over 300,000 employees, and we are spread across three administrations. That'd be the Veterans Benefits Administration, Veterans Health Administration, and the National Cemetery Administration. And the VA supports 20 million veterans, with 145 hospitals and over 1,000 outpatient facilities. So we're the largest integrated healthcare system in the nation. But our services do extend well beyond healthcare. We do have 56 regional offices, regional benefits offices, and 135 veteran cemeteries. And so the benefits offices allow veterans to get the benefits that they're entitled to after they've served in the military. All right, and then now to talk a little bit about OIT. So OIT is the Office of Information Technology within the VA. So the Lighthouse API program is under the OIT umbrella. So VA's digital transformation relies heavily on OIT. And within OIT, we collaborate with all three VA administrations. So they are our customers. And there's a staff of nearly 16,000 people in OIT, and more than half, 60% of OIT employees are actually veterans themselves. So the Lighthouse API program helps deliver exceptional customer experience, which is a top priority across all of VA. It's helping to drive IT modernization, and one of the pillars of our program is to offer seamless and secure interoperability, which actually goes right into this next slide here. So this is a kind of famous wall socket analogy that we use to describe APIs. From the outside, APIs provide a really easy way to plug in and get data. Behind the scenes, you don't really know how that's happening. It's really easy to plug and play. That's kind of the whole concept of APIs and sharing data through APIs. So we've used this wall socket image to kind of describe how APIs work to people who might not be familiar with them. So what are the key drivers behind VA Lighthouse? Well, we want to give veterans and their family members a digital experience that's on par with the commercial sector. We're constantly innovating to make things simpler and clearer for others, which includes veterans, VA business customers, and third-party developers. We're using IT solutions to address the confusion that people sometimes experience when they need to navigate a federal organization or its resources, and especially an organization as complex as VA. And, we hear a lot from veterans about their experiences interacting with VA, and, what we hear from them really helps us to build better products. So Lighthouse is a front door for VA's vast data stores. It's a formal invitation for private industry to join us in developing technology solutions that speed access to the care and benefits that veterans have earned and are entitled to. And through our partnerships with industry, we allow industry partners to plug into VA, creating a seamless user experience that's passed on to the veteran. So yeah, as I mentioned, we do have a focus on collaborating with industry partners. We allow third-party developers to securely access the information that they need to build helpful tools and services for veterans. And I'll talk a little bit about some specific examples of that in a few slides. But by developing and building APIs, we can connect apps that veterans already use to popular products that they own. And really with APIs and opening up the data within the VA, we can allow for a lot of innovation in the private sector. So third-party developers can plug into our APIs and build robust solutions that help veterans, that maybe we wouldn't have even thought of. There's all kinds of cool things that can be done when we open up that data and expose it for innovation. Our APIs grant programmers secure and efficient access to the data sets that we currently have available, including health data, benefits data, and veteran-specific data. And authorized third parties will continue to use these APIs to access critical veteran data and create new innovative solutions with private sector partners. So with that said, we do have some guiding principles on our program that we try to operate by. One of the biggest challenges at an organization the size of VA is figuring out which problems to solve. So we've kind of come up with a philosophy that we go by to help us decide which problems to solve. And these principles include, number one, ensuring that veterans can quickly and easily access services, building products that directly impact veterans and their families, and prioritizing opportunities that maximize impact for veterans. On any given day, we might come across 4 or 5 different problems that we could solve. And, one of the great things about our platform is that we do have the ability to pick which problems we're going to solve. But that, as I mentioned, that's also a challenge. So, we try to keep these three things in mind when weighing the benefits of tackling any one problem. So, once we've identified and prioritized the problems that we want to solve, then we go into, what we call user-centered design. That's a big philosophy that we have. We want to build for users, we want to build with users, not for them. So, we actually spend a lot of time talking to veterans. We spend a lot of time talking to veteran service officers. We spend a lot of time talking to people who interact directly with veterans and help veterans get access to their benefits. And so as we understand more of what they do and what their pain points are, we can build better products that ultimately help more veterans. And so as we're building, we do employ an agile development methodology, which allows us to build a minimum viable product and then iterate on that. So, get something out the door, build something, ship it, get feedback on it, iterate on it, and then keep evolving the product from there and ultimately build, just build products that people love using and that make their lives better. But we also want to create a world-class developer experience so that developers, third-party developers in the commercial sector who are building against our APIs, can easily develop against them. So, we want to provide a self-service experience to the extent possible. We want to have really great API documentation. We want to offer the ability for them to get an API key very easily. And really, I guess the ideal use case or the ideal experience would be having a developer come in and use our platform and build against our APIs without even necessarily talking to us. Of course, we want to hear from everyone, but if someone can come in start building without even talking to us, and we know that we've created a world-class developer experience. And on the slide here, you can see a screenshot of our developer portal, which we launched in 2018, and we've been iterating on our developer portal constantly over the last year, and it's come a long way, and we have a lot of cool things coming down the pike with it. All right, so let's get into some specific success stories. As I mentioned, so one space that we've done a lot of work in is in the benefits space. So one of the key things that veterans need when they come out of the military is access to benefits such as disability compensation. And right now, getting access to those benefits can be a pain point. There's a lot of really old, outdated processes. Everything's paper-driven. So we've decided to build APIs to help digitize that experience. We actually launched the Benefits Intake API in 2018, and that enables digital submission of veteran claims documents as PDFs directly to the VA. So that prevents the need for claims agents or veteran service officers to have to print out a claim document, throw it into an envelope, and they either drop it in the mail or fax it. And in the research we've done and in the veteran service officers that we've talked to, we've heard how timely that process can be. And in fact, they also have stacks of file cabinets where they're putting all this paper once they print out and mail it so that they have their own archived copy of it. So with this API, we've really allowed that whole process to be streamlined. And we've actually heard from one veteran service office that they've gone from 6 file cabinets to 1 file cabinet just in this past year. Because now they're doing things digitally. They're not having to print out a lot of paper. And it also actually, not only does it help the veteran service officers, it's also helping veterans themselves, because by being able to directly submit documents to the VA digitally, you've taken out that time that it would take to mail it and have it be received and processed by VA. So it does reduce the amount of time it takes a veteran to get their benefits. So we're actually, right now, we're cutting about 6 days from the process. There's still a lot of work to do. This is a very complex process, the end-to-end process of veterans getting benefits. But this is an example of that, of our agile development methodology that I mentioned. We wanted to pick a problem to solve that problem, make a dent, and then, start growing and iterating a more robust solution. And so one of the things we're doing right now is working on claim auto-establishment, which takes it a step further, and not only allows claims to be digitally submitted to the VA, but to have them be automatically established in a claims management system instead of having someone have to manually do that. So that'll put another big dent in the end-to-end processing time for getting veteran benefits. And then I'm a little over time, so I will try to speed up a little bit here. So yeah, success stories also with the Health API. The Health API allows veterans to access their own health records on their iPhones. So, for example, the Apple Health app on iPhones, it allows the Apple Health app to maintain a consolidated repository of veterans' allergies, conditions, immunizations, procedures, and vital signs across health systems. Currently in beta testing with Apple, so far over 150 veterans have signed up. That's just I guess these 3 examples are just 3 examples of APIs currently available on the Lighthouse API platform. And then the last slide here is human-centered design, which I've already touched on a little bit, but as I mentioned, we strive to give veterans the user experience that they would expect from the private sector. We are committed to understanding and addressing their needs. And as I said before, we design with users and not for them. And that's the really key pillar of our program. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Now for our next presentation, we'll hear from Terry.
Okay, good afternoon. I spent 8 years at the IRS as the CTO and CIO, and before that was in private enterprise at running IT for the Boeing Company, EDS, and Visa. So I've been around the IT mulberry bush, so to speak, for some time, and I've certainly seen the use of APIs grow phenomenally, actually, as a way to unlock the data that's stored in basically application-specific databases and such. Well, we have a federal data strategy, and the reason for that is to try to build applications and such to free up this data and provide customer-centric access to it. I think Andrew just gave a marvelous example of and several use cases of what's happening at the VA with respect to being customer-centric. Heavily focused to the external users, of course, but obviously there's benefit for the internal folk at the agency. And the whole point here is the data is locked up, and the reason for that is over time, way back in the mist of time, so to speak, programmers specified data formats, the naming convention and attributes of data without regard to an enterprise architecture or a data model, and thus the data very specific to a application is essentially locked away. If using a data strategy, APIs as an element of that helps free that up and provide access. And the reason, of course, is we don't want to redo every application in terms of a new data model. Although that's the way to handle new development, should always be using an enterprise data model so we don't recreate the problem going downstream. But for those applications for which every agency has hundreds, if not thousands, of locked away databases, we have to find a way to provide that information if we, in fact, are going to be customer-centric. And in providing that, it allows us to have these application-specific APIs that standardize the actual information someone wants, putting in place a common protocol that's specific, that as each application codes to that protocol, the exchange of information basically becomes seamless. As I say, this has been going on in the IT industry for a long time, but because of the now locked away problem of data, when I say locked away, I'll give one great example of that. The most numerous database in agencies, certainly the IRS, were access databases. Just hundreds of these created information files, but very, very specific to the person that created the application, and thus this information is essentially locked away unless you run the application. So an API allows these applications to be modified to free up that data and get at the whole thing of having essentially a universal data repository accessed through the APIs. It's a classic publish-subscribe model. One could code in web formats or application-specific or data management at the browser level, whatever, and then create all kinds of new services. And again, I would point to the work that Andrew did as wonderful examples of the way APIs are allowing them to provision new services for veterans. So I've become essentially a proponent of APIs as part of an overall data strategy. It's the data strategy itself that the OMB and the Lighthouse are pushing, and APIs as an element of that data strategy are allowing the data to be free. And if the data is free, basically transparent, CIOs and IT shops can actually build new capabilities and new services for their customers, be those internal or external. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Terry. Now we'll have Jeff turn the floor to him.
Hey, good afternoon. So my name is Jeff Estes. I lead the systems engineering team over here at Software AG Government Solutions, and really thank everybody for having me. So I'd like to start with this first slide. Let's get this thing to transition a little bit. Hang on a second. I'd like to start with this first slide because it really highlights the value proposition of APIs. You know, APIs are a really valuable business asset they can be and should be one of the foundational elements of your overall digital strategy. So, surprise, we all live in an API world. So we've had some examples already highlighted, but whether you realize it or not, our daily lives are actively using APIs, whether it's the credit card machine, at the store, the library, whether using Uber. The examples are actually endless. APIs are what makes it possible to expose data and services in web apps, mobile apps, televisions, IoT devices, and really the list goes on and on and on. Enterprises have absolutely huge amounts of data, as Terry has mentioned, and it's valuable, but it's often stuck in these isolated or outdated applications or data pools. This is what really fuels APIs. Whether it's on a mainframe, a client-server system, data store, NAS, or as Terry said, an Access databases, or maybe even worse, an Excel spreadsheet, this is kind of where data is. With APIs, you can not only unlock the value, but also leverage the value that both internal people use and external people use and services use. Unfortunately, all the data that's stuck in various states and numerous systems is kind of just out there, like Terry mentioned. APIs are a great way to go in and expose it so it's available to a much broader audience and initially a large numbers of developers. Internal developers, external developers, single applications, multiple applications. With APIs, developers can have direct access to the data and don't have to write every aspect of a specialized interface. As Terry had alluded to, in the old days, you would have an application and you would have specs done for the application, and you would have to very specifically do connections, or we used to call these point-to-point connections, to get data out of an environment or a data set. Today, developers don't need to know the internal details of the systems they're even connecting to. And in large regards, they probably shouldn't, and you don't want them to know every detail of the systems they're connecting to. Let the developers just really focus on building the applications themselves, instead of worrying about spending days and days and days on how to connect the data, how to grab the data. All that's taken care of it. We actually had a good example of that here at Software AG with some interns that we brought in. And in college, everyone is taught how to, they have to code for reading data, writing data, updating data. And the interns were actually shocked when we showed them how to use APIs, and they just realized that they didn't have to write the 10,000 lines of code to go do all that stuff. It was taken care of it inside the API. So it's kind of amazing to see the change and how the development cycles actually differ. So today, most APIs, as Terry mentioned, are based on common standards and protocols like REST, JSON, YAML. So it's really easy for developers to incorporate data into new applications, and in many cases, kind of go back and retrofit existing ones based on your new data standards. So what does this all mean? It means that development times can be reduced dramatically by using APIs. A good example, we've had many customers that use our API management platform, and they've actually seen reduced overall development time by 50%, which is unbelievable, to tell you the truth. According to Gartner, out of the top digital performing organizations, 42% of those organizations have created this new role of API product manager. And while trailing performers only have 6% have created that role. So the role is becoming more and more important, and the use of APIs is becoming more important. So where's this all going? It really means that your agency becomes easier to do business with for internal clients, external clients, when you have an API-centric development model and platform. APIs fuel innovation, and they really are the core tenet of digital transformation. So, where are most customers, we'll switch slides here, in the API journey right now? So, as Valdi said, we live in an API world, but how did we actually get here? And where do we go next? What is next? So if you take a look at the slide here, Most agencies and customers have started down this path already. They've identified data resources, hopefully. That can actually be one of the bigger challenges, is knowing what you actually have so that you can actually tap into it. Like Terry alluded to, a lot of this stuff is hidden out there in old applications. You can't find it. So that's actually a task that's ongoing right now. It gets complicated by the fact that a lot of agencies are kind of in the middle of this digital transformation, where they may be partially on-premise, or maybe some of their stuff is in the cloud and some of it's not. So they're really these hybrid environments. Maybe they have some old APIs, or SOA APIs. Maybe they're in the process of converting some of those APIs to REST APIs. REST APIs are generally a little bit easier to use and follow a looser set of standards. It doesn't mean that they're bad, but it means that they're easier to code. Or maybe, like I mentioned before, they're moving to on-premise in the cloud. One thing is for sure, APIs need to be managed. So to get the maximum value from an API, you need to manage it across its entire life cycle. It's not we can go and develop this one-off API, we leave it and forget about it, and we don't do anything with it ever again. We've all seen what that kind of does with normal programming exercises. You look back at something you did 10 years ago or 5 years ago, and you kind of question, why in the world did I do this? Right now, API is a mainstream requirement. You need to be able to publish APIs, test your APIs, promote your APIs. It's kind of hard to use an API or have a developer use it if he doesn't even know about it. So an API portal with collaboration tools, catalogs, search features, etc. is mandatory these days. Another big one, you have to protect your APIs. How are you protecting your APIs that you have exposed to the internet? Are they just kind of hanging out there? Are you using policies and security? Even though we try to scale down an API data set, no matter what, exposure is always a risk. That's the world we live in. Whenever you expose data to the outside world, there's risk. Our API gateway, for example, minimizes this risk with a reverse invoke that dramatically reduces the risk and exposure. So along with that, you have to monitor APIs. So if you see something going on, you need to know where and when and how that happens. So you need to be able to set policies. Maybe you want to, and we've seen this in several examples, maybe you want to limit the number of access times in a minute that someone can use an API so that something doesn't get flooded or there's a denial of service attack. Our gateway does that. And in some cases, maybe you even want to monetize your APIs. Maybe you have something that's really good and you see that you can get some money out of it by utilizing it and putting it and publishing it for general use. So if you look a little bit further down the lifecycle chain, you need to find a way to test and deploy automatically. If you have 500 plus APIs or maybe 1,000, it's not really realistic to go down every single API and try to create and manage them manually. So how do you do that? It really means that you need to develop some type of, and we call this all the time, DevOps functionality, CI/CD, these types of things. And this is kind of where the concept of microservices come into play. Customers are really starting to target specific scalable functionality, whereas before we kind of fudge it a little bit and we build these jumbo APIs. Now we try to build smaller, efficient services that are made into APIs that are scalable and manageable, utilizing some of the newer technology like Docker and Kubernetes. So we here at Software AG Government Solutions have a really modern ecosphere. We handle this entire lifecycle management. So it does all of this. I really look forward to showing and working with all of our customers throughout this journey and all of its digital and API initiatives. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. So thanks to all of you for sharing those insights with us today. And now we can move into the discussion portion of our program. So I think just for starters, for all three of you, to get our discussion started, you mentioned this, Jeff, in the timeline you just kind of walked us through, but I'd love to hear about where your agencies are currently in their API journey. And for Jeff and Terry, since you guys aren't at a government agency currently, just kind of if you could talk about how has access to data sets transformed via APIs and where you see it going in the future from the trends you're seeing. And we'll start with you,
yeah,
Andrew.
So this is Andrew from Department of Veterans Affairs. So as I kind of touched on in the presentation, our program was launched in 2018, and really over 2019, it's become a full-fledged initiative. We've had a lot more resources put into it, and we've really had a lot of great growth in the last year. And so really we are in a maturing state right now. And it's an exciting time because I can see some inflection points coming in our program in the next 12 months as we start to look at more internal adoption and then getting more developers outside the VA to be plugging into the APIs. But yeah, so right now I would say we are rapidly growing right now, but we are still young and we're still learning a lot.
This is Terry. Let me add in that APIs, again, are a part of the overall data strategy an agency should have. It is, after all, the federal data strategy, right? But one cannot just adopt a standard data model for all applications that an agency has. The conversion effort of those hundreds of applications over that standard data model the view is not worth the climb. But all new applications should go that way, so we don't create still new problems for access to the data. That being the case, then using APIs really frees up the resources. When the IRS had to implement the Affordable Care Act, and it was the heavy lifter for implementation of that law, we made heavy use of APIs for the application interfaces to take Affordable Care Act data and make it part of the tax record. Very, very, very successfully, I must add, irrespective of what your political views might be about the Affordable Care Act. We did, in fact, make it work. So APIs and using management techniques like Jeff mentioned are just a great set of tools to have in an IT quiver, so to speak, so that we can, in fact, get this data freed up and provision access, to external customers, again, like Andrew highlighted very well.
Yeah, so this is Jeff. I think a lot of our customers are, as I mentioned previously, they're kind of in this hybrid mode right now where they have a lot of assets that are on-premise, and they've kind of been mandated to go to FedRAMP and the cloud and all these things. And really, you need to be able to pull the data from a lot of different data sources and visualize it in one space, so one pane of glass. So we kind of call that mashups here at Software AG. And what that basically means, instead of having an API that will pull one particular data source, another API that pulls from another data source, we mash them together so that we have one API that may pull from a mainframe or maybe SAP or maybe your Excel database, if that's a good example. And we're seeing that used a lot more than I probably would have originally thought we would have. But it makes a lot of sense when, this is not something that happens, very quickly. It happens over time. I know we like to think this happens quickly, but that whole transition from going to on-prem and the cloud means you really have to have some capability in there that can read from just a variety of data sources all on kind of one platform. And that's one of the things that we do really well here. And we're seeing just the use cases all over the board at various agencies.
Andrew, I'd love to discuss a little bit more about that VA benefits API that we keep alluding to in our discussion, because it's really such a great example of kind of what we're talking about here. So you had mentioned that at VA, 65% of veterans' disability and pension claims prior to this have been coming through paper or fax, and how this new benefits API had helped just rapidly increase the way that's processed. So I was wondering if you could describe a little bit about the genesis of that VA benefits API when it comes to how you generated buy-in. What were some of those early key considerations you had to have to make sure this became a reality?
Yeah, so I think it all started with just kind of doing some research into the whole benefits application process, and really what happens behind the scenes within VA when a veteran applies for benefits. Typically right now we see it could take hundreds of days really for a veteran to get their benefits. If they apply for benefits, it could take hundreds of days for them to get a decision. And so we really drilled into that and tried to figure out, okay, how many hands is this passing through? Like where are the long tails in this process, basically? And we were able to kind of map everything out and have a clear picture of the different steps in the process and how long each step takes. And we decided to tackle the front end of the process, which is the intake process, claims coming into VA. And it wasn't the long tail by any means. There's, the whole process of processing a veteran's benefit claim towards the end, there's a lot of really time-consuming things like chasing evidence and communicating back to the veteran to get more information, having things missing, and having veterans have to schedule follow-up doctor appointments, but then they don't show up for their follow-up appointment because maybe they just didn't have a way to get there, anything like that. But we saw tackling the front end of the process as a really quick win because it was something that we could address immediately, and we could address it with a really low lift. So building an API that accepts PDF documents to be digitally transmitted to the VA, technically that's not a huge lift. And it was a way for us to demonstrate a win and demonstrate that we could be successful with APIs and that our program could be successful. And that was really the intent at the very beginning, and why we picked that use case of kind of digitizing the front end of the intake process.
Great. And then I guess to the larger panel as a whole, making this kind of a macro note, what are some other ways that you have seen API implementation be successful in organizations? Terry, you mentioned kind of the IRS and the Affordable Care Act. So are there any other use cases that you guys have seen similar to the VA benefits API that have really worked well and kind of been a win as you were referencing?
Yeah, I'll give another example. Again, I'll just in this case again use the IRS in the sense of looking for fraud, putting in place new technologies that allow for fraud detection as tax returns are filed. So while there may be new code sets, new functionality implemented, we still need access to previous tax information. And so the way to get that is through internally developed APIs and such. This worked very, very well, and for our ability to detect fraud, so good in fact that we detected far more than we were able to handle in the sense of having enforcement people to track after it, which caused another set of problems. But the net effect was, due to the APIs, that we were able to free up and utilize data from other sources in order to detect, let's just say, the fraud that some taxpayers were trying to get away with.
Yeah, I think another one that we've seen a big growth in is criminal justice. So, the federal government actually interfaces and with not only other agencies within the federal government, but at the state level and the local level. And this can get really complicated really quick. And what we've seen is APIs have been a really great way to kind of flip the other side of the coin there of integration, to kind of combine that data into something that may actually represent, hundreds of different environments out there, all the way down to, the local sheriff's office, all the way up to the FBI or something like that. And just being able to share that data in kind of I would say a neutral characteristic in how it's formatted has really become a benefit. And we've seen the actual development of the data, I'd say that, or massaging of the data, getting the data to the point where it's consumable. That whole process normally takes a really long time when you have so many different agencies at so many different levels. And we've really just seen this with APIs, being able to reduce that whole development cycle, simplify it, and kind of see how everything gets streamlined. So you can really have, almost, I like to call it drill down of data through APIs, where you're clicking and you get to the next level and then the next level and the next level. And so you can really go all the way from federal down to state, local, and it's just been a huge kind of movement that we've seen in that type of scenario.
This is Terry. I'd like to add that with the examples that Andrew's given with respect to Lighthouse and having a mechanism to coordinate API implementations inside of VA, taking the advice of what Jeff talked about with respect to managing APIs, be careful here with respect to your own agencies when you implement a broad set of APIs. Managing that set and realizing the value of that asset as a class, and then having the appropriate set of management tools to sustain the flood of APIs within your own agencies, so we're not creating still another problem of legacy code. I think the APIs themselves have to be managed, therefore, as part of your overall asset management and risk management program. And again, both Andrew and Jeff made reference to that.
Yeah, and I would just add that is one of the biggest challenges, actually, as we're growing our program and looking to onboard more APIs and really evangelize API adoption within the VA. The whole API governance is a huge thing. It's a huge component of it because we're only going to be as successful as our governance is, basically. If we just open the floodgates and allow anyone to put an API on our platform, we're not going to be successful. And that's something that we are doing a lot of work around right now to define those processes and how that's going to look. And it even goes back to weighing it against those pillars that I talked about in the presentation about the problems that we want to solve. We want to solve the problems that have a direct impact on veterans. Well, not every API that we can build internally is necessarily going to do that. And so that's another challenge that we have, as we look to grow the internal adoption of our platform.
Yeah, it really gets into kind of API catalogs, the whole management of APIs, setting policies on APIs, whether it's security policies. Security is huge, obviously. When you develop an API, you actually try to get the data that you're exposing really tight and small, so it's very specific. But even that's not enough, and that's why you really do need some management platform or API gateway. You actually need a way to kind of organize your APIs, which Terry's kind of alluding to, and that's really where you get an API portal, how you expose those, how you share the APIs, how you have people even know the APIs are there. That's also been a problem that we've seen customers have, where they have all these APIs, they develop them, and no one uses them because they don't even know they exist. And those are all challenges that can be overcome. You just have to kind of have the right environments and the kind of right guidelines involved, especially around the management piece of it. We're seeing tons and tons of cases where there's threats that come in. We've seen a couple of cases at some agencies where they've been flooded with one API just goes down and brings the whole environment down because it wasn't managed properly. And so you can really do some things with Kubernetes and spin up another one if you're seeing a lot of load. Maybe a good idea for Terry, tax season, maybe we need to have another API gateway spun up really quickly, or maybe a micro gateway that handles that type of thing during tax season, and then spin it down when you're not using it. So there's a lot of strategies that go into APIs and management, and it's gone a little bit beyond just I'm going to go code an API. You really do have to focus, like I mentioned in the slides there, on the whole life cycle of APIs and how that kind of handles it. And you need an ecosphere that can do that.
And just to add on to one thing that Jeff said about building a developer portal and how you're going to organize and classify your APIs, and then also how are people going to know about your APIs. Those are two things that I think that we are doing pretty well, honestly, on our program here at the VA. We have a whole team of user UX designers and UX researchers that help us, that help do a lot of testing and put a lot of thought into how we are organizing our APIs on our developer portal. And we also have a marketing and outreach team who are really helping to put the word out on the street, so to speak, about our program. And we've already seen a lot of success from that too.
It's actually one of my biggest pet peeves, being I'll call myself a former developer, is rewriting something that somebody already did. Just because I didn't know it didn't exist, right? And it just becomes more and more important. It's great that you guys are actually organizing that, because we've seen the other aspect of that is, if you're in an environment where you want to kind of co-collaborate, having the ability to collaborate on APIs or ask questions on them openly. I mean, some are great with the documentation, some are not. It really depends on who wrote them and what the standards are. But just having a format where everybody that's kind of using the same types of APIs can kind of comment it and collaborate is another thing that we've seen that's been really popular out there and with our customers and various agencies too.
Yeah, and actually before we leave this kind of conversation around the challenges and the barriers, I wanted to kind of circle back to the lifecycle timeline Jeff had shared earlier and just see if you guys had any thoughts on, kind of from a higher level, are there agencies seeing certain pain points at a specific part of that lifecycle that you're seeing?
This is from Terry again. This is where the concept of architecture really plays a role. An enterprise architecture combined with an agency data model allows us to then treat all the assets, be they APIs, the various other code sets, the data itself, all as assets. And it's that governance that was emphasized a couple times by Andrew and Jeff, I think, that really needs to be taken into account here. We don't want to create still another legacy problem. So treating these items, the ability to access the data through these APIs, which provides beautiful examples of being customer-centric. At the same time, we then don't want to create still another legacy issue for the follow-on IT and business community. So to treat these things as all part of an enterprise architecture, that it's people, process, it's the assets, it's the various kind of code sets, and the data itself all needs to be under governance. And I'm a big proponent of an enterprise architecture and data models to do that.
Yeah, actually, we have a couple of data modeling products that actually really do tie into our API gateway and API portal. So I mean, that's a good segue, Terry, for me. But we do take that kind of approach on, at least when we do our reference models for customers and show them how, at least from our point of view, how things should be done. But that is something that ties into it, and it's process management, cataloging, whether our enterprise architecture solution actually ties into things like Technopedia, so your life cycle times and all that. It all comes into play and it all ties together with the APIs, because what you can do is actually, if you have the right EA tool and the right EA management structure there that you're using, you can actually tie the API to actual physical assets, or maybe in this case it's a cloud asset that has, the data that you're trying to get. Maybe the data is going to retire in 5 years, and that can actually dictate how you're going to run and use your APIs and when you need to redevelopment. And it actually is kind of, I didn't put it on the slide, but it actually really is the first flag here, define customer journeys. Journeys are another terminology for enterprise architecture and figure out where you're going with the data and kind of cataloging it. The other thing that we've seen a big push is just identifying the resources, like the second dot here when we're talking about challenges. Just identifying what agencies have out there is sometimes a really big challenge, and it's often overlooked. It can take a long time to just go figure out what data you have and where is it. And that's really the first step. And once you do that, then you can start really designing your APIs and moving forward. And normally what really happens is you kind of have two streams where one is trying to find the data and somebody on the back end is kind of taking it from the top down and trying to match up the API to the data, and the data gets found. But it's still a very big problem, just identifying the resources that you have out there and where is it and how do you get to it. So that's what we've been seeing out there.
Many of our listeners today work in the public sector, and many also work in the private sector. So, Andrew, in your presentation, you mentioned collaborating and working with industry. So I was curious if you guys would be able to speak to, as a group, what are some of the benefits and opportunities that you see with public and private working together?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, one of the things with the private sector is, I think, a much faster pace of innovation in general. Not as many layers to navigate, not as much minefields to really push through, I guess, to make change quickly. And that's really what APIs power. As we've talked about throughout this whole webinar today, I mean, APIs make it really easy to unlock data and make it seamless for development to be done on top of it. So I guess, we've seen it in working with the private sector. We've seen that in action, basically. That was one of the bets that we made with building an API program and working with the private sector, and we have seen that come true. And I'm looking forward to seeing other success stories down the line here as we get more and more, as we start building more APIs and getting more partners.
Yeah, this is Terry. I would add that there's certainly good historical examples of this public-private partnership in the standards bodies that work typically at IEEE levels, but also in the open source communities, ranging from the whole browser-to-browser standards for HTML or HTTPS. Those kinds of things agreed to by the communities working together because all having common interest, and of course all the open source code. Clearly both for the value creation in government and in private enterprise.
Yeah, it's a good point, Terry, because if you look back at things, the original APIs that came out, I mean, they've been around for 20 years, whether people realize it or not, were kind of generally developed by banking institutions. And there was a lot of security around it, a lot of structure around it, and it was actually very difficult to code those. And as this kind of got more steam, what we see today with REST APIs actually are a little bit, they don't have some of the same security standards, but it was actually done through a public-private partnership that standard got built. And it's a loose standard, which is good because that's kind of fermented the development and the speed and everything else that goes with it. But it's one of the classic examples of where public space has met private space, and we use it ubiquitously across the board today. You very rarely don't see something that's not a REST API anymore.
Definitely. And actually, as a reminder to the audience, as we near the end of the hour, feel free to submit any questions you may have through the portal on the platform. But just kind of continue our conversation, I did want to touch on customer experience as well, since obviously there are numerous benefits to how citizens interact with government agencies through these platforms. So, Andrew, you referenced it very well with your case study with benefits, but just wanted to talk about any other examples of how the customer experience is improved through these processes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and actually for the Lighthouse platform at VA, I kind of think of customer experience as two-pronged because our customers are developers that are building on top of our APIs, and then and then those applications in turn help veterans. So really, veterans are our first customer, but our direct customer are developers. So we're looking at building tools that will make that whole developer experience as seamless and positive as possible. And so we've learned a lot, as I talked about in the presentation, from some of the research that we've done. Anytime that we're making a change to our developer portal, we test it. We talk to other developers. We have them come out and go onto the portal and kind of like watch as they're using our portal and as they're building against an API, and we get to learn a lot about things that we can do to make the whole experience better. For example, in some of the testing that we've done, we've gotten direct feedback about documentation improvements that we can make, different functionality that we can add into our developer portal, like curl commands, like the ability to just plug in a curl command and immediately be able to get a response from the API back and see how the API works. So yeah, I would say just, customer experience obviously is an important thing, and it's something that we take seriously. And I think we've learned quite a bit about it in the research that we've done.
This is Terry again. I'll use an example of the IRS and such. The IRS getting its feet wet with respect to implementation of web capabilities for taxpayers and such. One of the most popular applications was finding out the status of your tax refund and such. Provisioning that through a set of APIs on the web in our portal. That application is probably the single highest usage of the web portal that we discovered. But that again is being customer centric, discovering what users really want. There's now also, if I call it, an account that people can set up, a taxpayer account, so that people can get access to their tax return and other information directly on the web with appropriate security and such. That, of course, are implemented through a series of APIs. Very nice, well received, very targeted, very functional, specific set of applications, but it's freeing up that data that's inside the IRS legacy systems and now making it available through a platform that everyone has access to.
Yeah, I mean, I think a good example that people probably don't even realize is out there is NOAA. So whenever you get the weather on your phone or, on any other application or on a website, I almost guarantee you that the weather you're getting is from NOAA and through an API that they provide out there to get the weather. So, there's lots of examples like that. I actually have the benefit of seeing a lot of very successful cases out there, IRS being one of them for sure, where, just the exposure and using APIs is kind of leveraged. If you realized how often you are using a government-provided API successfully, I think part of the job is not part of the goodness of the job is not knowing that you're even using a government, API, but you also get the benefit of the data that's out there, because that's still the largest repository data is still the federal government to date. And this is a great way to expose them and get the data out there.
It's a coming set of applications, but the census next year, the Census Bureau is implementing a data lake and building a set of APIs around it for, again, citizen access to that information that'll be stored when the census returns are processed. Again, sort of watch that space.
Definitely. And unfortunately with that, we're coming up on the end of the hour, so it's time to kind of wrap up our program, and we've reached the end of our session. And it sounds like there's a lot of exciting work in the field, and we're excited to see kind of where we move forward in the coming years. But just before we depart, Andrew, Terry, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to Software AG for hosting today's webcast and bringing all of us together. This webcast will soon be available to view on demand, so please share it with your colleagues. And once again, thank you and have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.